G.I. Jane 2, can't wait to see it. All right? Oh, wow.
Will Smith smacks Chris Rock in the face. Different versions of that headline have been dominating the news cycle all over the world today. Everybody's talking about this. It is being dubbed the most shocking moment in Oscar history. People everywhere are talking about that unbelievable exchange. It happened after Chris Rock made a joke about Jada Pinkett Smith's hair, mocking her bald head. Smith then got up, slapped Chris Rock before returning to his seat, yelling from the crowd. The Academy has now launched a formal review. Joining us live to talk about the slap that was heard all around the world is Erica Eiffel, columnist at the Hill Times, Kathleen Newman, deputy director at Refinery 29, and Duin Nanda, an LA-based TV host and producer. Thank you all for joining us tonight. There really is so much to get into. I don't know about you guys, but my first reaction was, is this a bit? Is this real? Because at first Will Smith was laughing. I want to go around and get everybody's reactions. I want to ask you what you saw last night. Did you see a man assaulting another man? Did you see a man defending his wife? Male toxicity? Erica, what did you see last night?
Well, I think, honestly, you could, depending on who you talk to, you could attribute all of those things to last night. I think from the outside, it definitely looks like a sort of toxic masculinity, as one likes to say, that sort of forces men to defend a woman's honor. But when you look at it through a racial lens, that view gets a little distorted. And you get to the point where Black women are, probably the least protected people in society, or one of, and are not sort of protected, really. There's a reason that hashtag Protect Black Women exists. And so when you look at it through a racial lens, and especially somebody with a disability, the view becomes a little bit skewed, different.
And I think it is important to see it through a different lens. Kathleen, we'll come to you next. What did you see last night? How would you describe that exchange?
I think I agree with Erica in that you saw really all of the above. I think you saw something that was shocking and that at first I also thought was part of a bit. And then you saw real anger and real human emotions from Will Smith. And you did see also in his speech him reacting and saying that, I was trying to protect my family. And even though maybe that's not the best way he should have gone about it, he has now since apologized. That's breaking. He just released this statement apologizing to Chris Rock. Last night, he apologized to the Academy, to his peers. He has now since apologized to Chris Rock, said he should have handled this differently. So I think that a lot of things are at play here. A lot of things can be true. One of them is that, yeah, he probably shouldn't have slapped someone on live television. But also, Chris Rock made an ableist joke against a Black woman and her hair. And we know that Black women are discriminated against for our hair. We have been for decades and centuries. And so I think that there are a lot of things at play and there is nuance in this conversation. And the reaction to Will Smith has actually been racist and unfortunate and frustrating. And that doesn't excuse his action, but I think that that also needs to be a part of this conversation.
Okay, you think the reaction has been racist. I want to talk about Will Smith's apology. He just posted this to Instagram. We'll try to bring some of it up for you on our screen here. Here's what he is saying on Instagram. Violence in all of its forms is poisonous and destructive. My behavior at last night's Academy Awards was unacceptable, inexcusable. Jokes at my expense are part of my job, but a joke about Jada's medical condition was too much for me to bear, and I reacted emotionally. I would like to publicly apologize to you, Chris, and I was out of line. I was wrong. I am embarrassed, and my actions were not indicative of the man I want to be. There is no place for violence in a world of love and kindness. Duin, so we're finally hearing an apology from Will Smith. He did apologize last night. He apologized to his fellow nominees in the Academy, but he didn't apologize to Chris Rock. What do you make of this?
Absolutely. I mean, even watching his speech at the Oscars live, you could tell that he was himself shaken up by his actions. Clearly, based on this latest apology that he has issued, he's acknowledging the fact that he reacted in a moment of rage, that it's not indicative of who he is as a person. Even in his Oscar speech, he talked about being on this earth and feeling his purpose at the moment to spread love and protect his family. So I think it's very unfortunate that such a huge moment in his career has been overshadowed by this controversy. Was that the way that he should have reacted? Absolutely not. But to Erica and Kathleen's point, it's a very sensitive topic and something that I guess he was not expecting, not prepared for, and felt that that's what he needed to do in the moment. And it's just uncomfortable and sad to watch, on an international stage to have this happen. It's sad for every party involved. From what I'm reading, Chris Rock's joke was actually not approved because sometimes presenters and hosts go out and have a bit of ad lib and improvise, and that's not necessarily approved. So to everyone at the Oscars production team's knowledge, Chris Rock's joke was not supposed to be included, and it was not something that was approved. So I think there's a lot of different things to inquire about here. I think we're in 2022. There's absolutely no need to be making jokes at other people's expense, especially about their appearance or about a disability or something that I can't control. So I think a larger discussion needs to be had about what entails comedy now that we're kind of more aware. Just sad to see this unfold this way.
Okay, so let's talk about the joke then, Erica. Some people are saying, Will Smith needs to take it easy. It was just a joke. But this was a joke about a black woman and her hair in a very public setting. Is it possible to condemn the violence? I don't think anybody out there is saying what Will Smith did was right. But is it also possible to condemn black women being disrespected in public spaces in the same breath?
Well, yeah, I think you can acknowledge that black women, as Kathleen said, are discriminated against because of our hair. We're sent home because our hair doesn't look professional enough. When we don't have enough hair, it's a problem. A black woman's hair is political. And so I think that the joke was just bad taste, to be honest. Like, never punch down is the point. And so when you make jokes at a black woman's expense, especially a black woman who has a disability, I think it's in poor taste. And Chris Rock himself has a bit about how everybody, quote, deserves an ass whooping, unquote. So I really wonder how he's taking this as art imitates life, or life imitates art.
He was caught off guard last night, that's for sure. Kathleen, there was also a lot of good that happened last night. Not all of us are talking about this, right? The first deaf man picking up an Oscar, an acting Oscar, that's a big deal. For the first time, the Oscars were put on by an all-black producing team. 2 black women hosted. Should the Will Smith-Chris Rock moment even define what happened last night, define the 2022 Oscars?
I mean, I don't see how it doesn't. It was the most shocking thing that has ever happened at the Oscars, at least in my lifetime. So I think that you can, again, a lot of things are true at the same time. I think that you can separate the fact that this was an all-black producing team and that Will Smith did this really shocking thing that, of course, we're going to be talking about for days, for months, for years. And have it not take away as well from someone like Questlove winning for his documentary Summer of Soul, which was an incredible moment. And that happened right after the Chris Rock thing. And so it really got overshadowed. And so I think that there's no way that this is not the story that comes away from last night. But I think you're right in that there are a lot of other stories that also deserve attention, like Coda's win, like Troy Kotzer's win, like Questlove's.
Okay, Doolin, the LAPD confirming today that Chris Rock, he didn't file a police report. He will not be pressing charges. We are hearing from the Academy, though, saying that it condemns the actions of Will Smith and it will launch a formal review now. Tell us more about this.
I mean, it's just interesting to see how this is going to play out, because at the end of the day, whether or not you disagree or agree with Will Smith's actions and his intent, to be able to get up on stage and assault somebody on international television is something that should not be taken lightly. And so I think regardless of where you stand, having some sort of action taken, disciplinary action taken, I think is inevitable. People have come out and said that there may be some sort of punishment in terms of having his membership to the Academy revoked. Whoopi Goldberg released a statement saying that she does not believe that his Oscar is going to be taken away. She is on the board of governors for the Academy, and especially since Chris Rock has not pressed any charges, they don't think that it's going to, actually affect Will Smith's Oscar, and it shouldn't. I mean, he had an incredible performance in King Richard, and he absolutely deserved that that award. But in terms of seeing disciplinary action taken to prevent people from feeling like they have the ability to just walk up on stage and take physical action, I mean, he could have grabbed his mic or could have made a statement about, comedians needing to change the way they make jokes at somebody else's expense. However, I think it's the assault aspect of this that's going to affect him very negatively.
For sure. Erica, we've got about 20 seconds left here, but I have to ask you, Will Smith, should he be stripped of his Oscar? Some people are calling for that. Is that ridiculous? What kind of repercussions should he face?
Does Harvey Weinstein? I think they stripped Harvey Weinstein's Oscar, actually. But as I recall, Casey Affleck had sexual assault charges against him when he got his Oscar. So nobody talked about stripping him of his. Or maybe they did. I don't know. But I think that's beyond the pale, to be honest.
Okay.
And I would wonder why those rules are different for him instead of somebody like Casey Affleck.
All good questions and questions worth being asked. So we'll leave it there. Erica Eiffel, Kathleen Newman, and Duin Nanda, thank you all for your time and your perspective. Just as the province gets ready to do away with all pandemic restrictions, medical experts say Ontario may be heading toward a sixth wave of COVID-19. There are almost 800 people in hospital with the virus tonight. That is a considerable jump. To put things into perspective, there were 600 hospitalizations reported around 10 days ago. 13 more people were admitted to the ICU overnight, and our test positivity rate jumped to 18% this week, the highest rate since late January. So where are we headed? What do we do about this? And is the Ford government being too hasty in scrapping public health restrictions? Let's bring in Dr. Peter Uni, Scientific Director of Ontario's COVID Science Advisory Table, Raywat Deonandan, Epidemiologist and Associate Professor at the University of Ottawa, and Dr. Alan Grill, Chief of Family Medicine at Markham Stouffville Hospital. Good to see all of you. Thanks for being with us. Dr. Uni, experts in Quebec say that province has now entered a sixth wave. Is Ontario heading that way? Are we there? How do we know?
Oh, we're in the middle of it. When you look at our wastewater, it's very clear. You can call it however you want. It's a resurgence of the Omicron wave we had, or a sixth wave. The point is really to understand this is not a BA2 wave. We can't blame the subvariant, that is out there. This is a throw caution to the wind wave. How my colleague Lauren Cipriano actually calls it. She's right with that. The point here really is it's entirely our responsibility what we're seeing, and we just got a little bit too much ahead of ourselves, and here we are, and we just have now a task at hand that's to keep the slope of the wave upwards relatively flat, so that we're not challenged again in our hospitals.
Okay, interesting. Raywat, we just heard Dr. Uni say he thinks we're in the middle of this sixth wave. He also just talked about Ontario's COVID-19 wastewater data. Tell us sort of a troubling story here. How many people do you think actually have the virus tonight? And do you think we're in a sixth wave, in the middle of it?
I have no idea how many people have the virus now, probably because we're not doing testing. Testing is broken. The best data we have comes from things like wastewater testing and sentinel surveillance. There's no formal definition of what constitutes a wave. We're in the middle of something, and Dr. Uni is right. It's not driven by BA2. I don't think we've felt the full thrush of BA2's impact yet. What we're experiencing here is the effects of the loosening of restrictions and the fact that we still have a largely susceptible population. So we're in the middle of definitely an increase in cases that is wave-like. So if you want to call it a wave, it's definitely a wave.
Okay, so we can't even blame the variant. That's sort of concerning. Dr. Grill, what's the latest out of your hospital? What are you seeing?
Yeah, so in my family practice office, we're definitely seeing more patients with symptoms than we were, let's say, 2 weeks ago. They're coming into our urgent care clinic, and we see those patients in the evening in our office, and a lot of them obviously are symptomatic. We're also getting more lab tests back than we were getting a couple weeks ago with patients who have COVID. And when I call my patients just to check in and see how they're doing, most of them tell me that they have it and the rest of their household has it. So this virus is spreading quite a bit. I think the other thing that I'm reminding all of my patients about is the fact that we do have assessment centers across Ontario where patients can actually get access to treatments depending on their risk factors. So if you're older than age 70, if you're unvaccinated or undervaccinated, if you're immunocompromised, even if you're pregnant, a lot of those patients that come down with symptoms, they've got to present quickly to their primary care provider or one of the assessment centers because they may be eligible for treatment. And even if it turns out they're not eligible for treatment, They can have a remote monitoring program where they get things to measure their oxygen saturation at home just to make sure they don't get worse. So I'm reminding people about the treatments we have out there. And the last thing is there's a great website called confusedaboutcovid.ca that's been put out by family physicians. A lot of Q&As there, very helpful for patients. Please check it out. It answers a lot of questions if you're confused about what's going on right now with COVID-19.
Okay, that is good to know. Dr. Uni, the province we know is hoping to lift all COVID-19 restrictions by April. And the Premier says, once we say goodbye to these restrictions, they're not coming back. Should we reassess? Is this a good idea? What do you think?
Yeah, it probably won't play out this way. Yeah, we just need to be aware of that. Two things to add quickly. The numbers you asked about, current numbers of infections, wastewater allows us to triangulate that. And we estimate right now that we see daily 30 to 35,000 infections in the province, one thing. And what Dr. Grill has said before, if you really want to make sure that you understand and are uncertain about that, whether you would qualify for treatment and you have symptoms, you can also dial 1866 as a number. If you're vulnerable, under-vaccinated or not vaccinated or immunocompromised, as described before. Now, your question, the point really is we need to be aware of that. We're, again, if we're not careful, in the middle of a tidal wave, meaning the force of infection is so much that high-risk settings will be, in the middle of this. It will find its way also into high-risk settings. If we now lift masking, for instance, in congregate settings, etc., this could be very, very challenging. So I would not believe it will happen that way yet. We first need to ride out this wave and hope that the peak is not too high and that we know will be below perhaps 2,000 people in the hospital. It could well go up that much. It will be higher than our projections. Why? Because people actually didn't change their behavior moderately, but more than that. And therefore, we first need to write this out before we lift any more restrictions and strongly recommend to people, again, please mask, please get vaccinated.
Please mask, please get vaccinated. That's been your message all along. Ray Watt,
exactly.
How do you feel about what's to come here? I mean, some of us have ditched masks, and come April, there will be no restrictions in Ontario. That's according to the Ford government. How do you see this playing out?
Well, first, we shouldn't be tying the lifting of restrictions to these arbitrary calendar dates. These should be tied to observable, measurable epidemiological indicators. Second of all, to echo what Dr. Uni just said, I'm concerned about the rate of increase in certain demographics. The rate of climb in cases amongst those over 80 is troubling. We still have a large proportion of people who cannot be vaccinated. Those are kids under 5. We have to do what we can to protect them. So I anticipate, just as night follows day, that a rise in cases will be followed by a rise in hospitalizations and a rise in deaths. Probably less so than we have previously in the pandemic due to the power of vaccination, but unavoidably so. That is a truism. Cases are followed by hospitalizations, followed by deaths. We have to protect our healthcare system. We have to protect the vulnerable. So it's way too early to be lifting restrictions like this. We should keep the easily maintainable restrictions or tools like mask wearing, vaccination, and symptom checks as alive as we can, as long as we can.
Okay. Dr. Grill, from a healthcare standpoint, how ready are we to take on another wave, whatever you want to call this, that we're seeing here in Ontario? We are hearing from the Ministry of Health tonight. It says the latest modeling shows our hospitals and healthcare system can manage any of the projected scenarios put out by the science table. Do you agree with that?
In terms of the modeling, I think Dr. Uni might be better at answering that question. I can tell you that, they try their best to see which direction things are going in terms of the cases. And obviously there's some uncertainty with regards to that. But in terms of whether we're ready to manage it, all I can say is that, my hat goes off to all of the healthcare workers, both in the acute care setting, the community setting, that have worked very hard and tirelessly to serve our communities the best we can. I'm hoping the numbers don't go up to the point where we have to delay more care. I mean, there was an article this week in Canadian Family Physician talking about all of the screening for cancer that was delayed last year and all the catch-up we need. And so the last thing we want to do is to have patients who are not seeking care because they're worried about COVID or they're worried about leaving their homes. And all of a sudden you have a bunch of sick people with COVID. And on top of that, you have people that aren't managing their other healthcare needs that we have to look after. So We're going to continue to do our best with the resources that we have. But in terms of the modeling, I would leave that up with to maybe for Dr. Uni to comment on.
Okay, Dr. Uni, I will give you a chance to quickly respond to that. What do you make of what the ministry is saying tonight? It's saying, you know what, we're prepared no matter what comes our way.
I think what is important to understand is once more, we were not able, because of the change in testing, to calibrate all of our models also for worst case scenarios. So what we've shown in our modeling is just a scenario if there's a moderate increase in transmission, and this corresponds to a moderate change in behavior of people. That's not what we're seeing anymore. We see more than that. People mask less and they have more contacts. Therefore, you can expect that our numbers will be higher than what we projected, the upper limit. It would go more towards a worst case scenario, and that's important to realize. Most likely we won't see the same numbers as before. We were above 4,000 in the wards, for example, but it could be quite high, and we don't want to interfere with regular care here.
Okay, and I just want to point out to our viewers as well that Dr. Uni thinks there are between 30 to 35,000 COVID-19 infections in the province tonight. That is important. Ray Watt, let's talk about developments in the U.S. The FDA there authorizing fourth doses of Pfizer and Moderna shots for those people older than 50 and older. Is this the right move? Is this something we should try and think about here at home?
It's something we're going to have to think about at some point. I think it's probably a bit too early to implement that here. The power of 3 doses in terms of vaccine efficacy against transmission, infection, hospitalization, death is still pretty strong. Our current challenge is not 4 doses. Our current challenge is getting 3 doses to more people. We have 47% of the nation having been boosted. That's way too low. So I'd like it if we had a full public health push on to encourage greater uptake of that 3rd dose.
Okay, we'll leave it there. Ray Watt Deonandan, Dr. Peter Uni, and Dr. Alan Grill, thank you so much for your time tonight.
More Homes for Everyone proposes smart, targeted policies for the immediate term that will make housing fair for hardworking Ontarians and get all types of housing built faster for those who need it and who want it. Our government has skin in the game, and we're doing our part to unlock and fast-track housing.
The housing supply crisis is a countrywide issue, one that will require all levels of government to step up and work together. That is why our government will work with municipalities on vacant home taxes to help address the issue at the local level. We will also consult on ways to discourage construction slowdowns that may be artificially driving up prices. And we will continue to call on the federal government to work with us to increase supply of housing in the province for Ontario families.
The Ontario government introduced a new housing bill today as part of a wider plan to tackle a worsening housing crisis. The Ford government's More Homes for Everyone plan was tabled at Queen's Park this afternoon. It includes dozens of actionable items aimed at reducing red tape and speeding up development in the province. The objective, to boost Ontario's housing supply, to build homes faster. That's something experts have been calling for years now. For a closer look at what this means for Toronto home buyers, we're joined live by City Councillor Anna Bilo. She is also the chair of Toronto's Planning and Housing Committee. Kevin Krigger is the president of TREB, the Toronto Real Estate Board, and Richard Lyle is the president of ResCon. Thank you all for joining us tonight. Councillor, we'll begin with you. We heard from the housing minister today. He thinks he needs municipalities at the table. He suggested that that's not really happening. He said that many are not ready to implement the ambitious policies the province's Housing Affordability Task Force recommended last month. I want to ask you how you respond to his comments.
Well, I think it was a good recognition that he needs municipalities at the table. Housing supply and dealing with the housing situation and the housing spectrum needs the 3 orders of government at the table. And I think I liked to what I heard him saying, that we need to work with municipalities. I think that just saying that if municipalities approve things faster is going to all of a sudden increase supply, it's very simplistic. We do recognize that there's improvements that need to happen. The City of Toronto has been working on it. We have our own change processes. We've introduced things like concept to keys, where we're working into that direction as well. But there's things that influence the supply, that things like supply chain, things like labor, the infrastructure that we need. Those will influence the supply as well. And so it's you can't just point the finger at municipalities and think that that all of that is going to get solved, because it won't.
Yeah, so many factors at play. Richard, help us understand how much red tape developers and builders are dealing with, especially in a city like Toronto.
Well, it's significant. I think, if you can build here, you can build just about anywhere in the world. We've looked at the amount of government bodies and agencies that are involved in the approvals process, and we actually counted 45. So we do have some very significant challenges there, and there is the need to streamline and digitize and modernize the process. Right now, it's not obviously working very well because we're ranked probably the second lowest country, I believe, of the OECD countries, 35 developed countries, on how quickly we process approvals, applications, that kind of thing.
Right, so let's talk about the province's plan then, Richard. It says it wants to speed up home construction by fast-tracking approvals for land planning, and you say that's something we've been struggling with. Right now, it can take up to 9 months for a building to be approved in this country. Is this a good plan? Did you like what you heard at Queen's Park today?
Well, I think what the government's doing, and the deputy mayor said it correctly, they need to have the municipalities on board, and there has been a lot of pushback on the Housing Affordability Task Force report. And I think there's a level of awareness that we haven't quite reached yet with respect to how serious this problem is and how far behind we are. Amongst the G7 countries, we've got the lowest amount of housing per capita and the highest costs. Those are not good metrics. So the challenge is there. I think what the government's doing here is they're taking an incremental approach, which is sensible. I mean, I'd like to see more, of course, but you've got to bring people along with this. The one thing I really like is the updated housing plans that they're going to have every year, because all too often we've done things like this. We've had reports, we've had recommendations, and then they kind of get forgotten. And this way, I don't think they will be forgotten, and the government has indicated further measures as time goes on. But the real test is going to be if we need the 1.5 million homes, which I would say yes we do, because no one's really shot down that number. Then we have to plan on, okay, how are we going to get there, right? And what do we need to do it? And if by this time next year, for example, we haven't seen any real kind of measurable changes, or maybe just some incremental stuff, but nothing that's going to get us to the 1.5 million, then of course you're going to need further measures. And I would argue that we will need further measures to deal with this issue.
Yeah, that's a big one for sure. Kevin, we know that the legislation table today, it doesn't address many of the 55 recommendations the Housing Task Force put out last month, and notably missing from this list is that plan to build 1.5 million homes over the next decade. Many have said this would be a game changer. Is that something you were watching for today, and how disappointed are you that that wasn't included in the province's plan, not today at least?
I think everyone was expecting some form of incremental approach. Obviously, the supply crisis we see ourselves in now is something that's developed over many, many years, really of inaction across many levels of government. And, to expect a plan to come forward that instantaneously addresses all of the concerns and all of the issues is totally unrealistic. So we certainly are encouraged that a number of really positive ideas have come forward, certainly tying in financial incentives to municipalities for speeding up zoning reviews and looking at cutting red tape around the planning process. I think the biggest fundamental change that would ultimately address supply is a review of exclusionary zoning, which basically accounts for probably 70% of land in neighborhoods across the city of Toronto and in many other municipalities as well, looking at opportunities for gentle intensification and as of right opportunities for higher density development really is something that's going to have to come to the forefront, but probably won't happen until after the election.
Right, and for all of that to happen, municipalities have to be on board, right? So, Councillor Bailau, we know the task force wants to do all of these things. It's identified these things as solutions. It wants to add density in neighborhoods as a way of creating more housing. It wants to cut back on development delays. It also wants to eliminate municipal policies that focus on preserving neighborhood character. And it looks like there has been some resistance to that. Richard was just talking about some of that pushback. What do you say? How do you respond when municipalities are accused of pushing back? And do you not think that these are the appropriate solutions here? I mean, we're in the midst of a housing crisis, and it's a very serious problem.
Absolutely. In the City of Toronto, we do have a project going on, which is called the EHON, the Enhancing Housing Opportunities in Toronto, that is looking exactly at that. We do believe that we need to build up the missing middle. We do believe that we speak with our communities. It is important to note that the province is creating a working group with municipalities to address this. I think what they've heard is that maybe a one-size-fits-all across the province might not work. But I do think it is really important to address the exclusionary zoning and to have municipalities having these changes and these conversations. It is part of the solution. There's no question about it. In Toronto, we're well on its way, and we believe it is something that needs to be addressed.
Okay, well, it's good to know that the city is taking that seriously. And I know you've mentioned that the City of Toronto is working on a number of changes. Richard, we'll come to you next. We heard from one BMO economist today describing what we're seeing as a full-scale attack on Canadian home prices. I'm sure you saw that headline. He's painting a pretty grim picture. So I want to ask you, we've been talking about boosting supply for so many months now. Is that even enough to tackle this affordability crisis? Is it enough?
Well, this particular step right now will put a dent in the problem, but as was said, there is more that will need to be done. I have no doubt about that in my mind. Because, we have to approach it from the perspective and say, okay, how are we going to get that 1.5 million homes? What are these various measures going to produce? And then add it up. And that's where the annual updates will be handy, but, we still have an immediate problem right now, and it's very, very serious. I mean, there's a lot of people that are struggling to get housing, and our immigration numbers are going up. We need the immigrants because we have an aging population. But the question is, where are they going to live, and how are we going to produce the housing for them? And then you do have social housing. So there are steps that are going to be needed there because those social housing lists have been growing year after year. And it's connected to market housing because the more expensive market housing becomes, the fewer people can afford it. They end up on a social housing list quite often. So, this requires urgent attention. However, we do recognize that I think you can maybe only bite off so much at a given point in time. The timelines that they've set in this particular step now with respect to site plan approvals and zoning changes is definitely very positive. But there's much more that needs to be done in terms of creating common rules and standards across the province. In terms of as of right zoning, as the deputy mayor said, they got to tackle that exclusionary zoning problem. It's massive. There's a ton of land out there that could be and should be redeveloped, especially for a city like Toronto, which aspires to be a global city. Well, to be a global city, you got to have we got to fix that missing middle problem. The 6 to 12 story buildings on avenues and main streets that, there's been over 20 reports on that, and we still really haven't made any progress on it. So, as someone said, this is a very complex issue. We know what the solutions are, and they're in the hands of various players. There's 3 levels of government, there's multiple agencies and commissions and so on. And one of the things we do need, and this is pointing in that direction, is much more transparency and accountability in the process, because quite often, the development industry pays for the development and building approvals process. Right. And if you know, there should be disciplines on that. There should be key performance indicators, standards, and that kind of thing. And that's where we need to go. Will we get there fast enough? You know, that's arguable. I think we're going to have to move faster on this, and I think time will prove that out to be the case.
Yeah, time is of the essence for sure, and I've run out of time. So, Kevin, I've got about 20 seconds left here. I'll just ask you this, because everybody's watching for what the Bank of Canada does next, right? And it is expected to announce a steep interest rate hike next month. Give us the big picture takeaways here. Talk about the impact. Do you think this will mean fewer bidding wars? Does this cool the market? Does it do anything at all?
I think fundamentally we are in a supply crunch, and that really is what is and will continue to be the biggest driver in the market. We've seen, obviously, part of the plan that came forward focused to demand suppression. We've tried it. It hasn't worked. 2018 was the introduction of the foreign buyer tax. We've seen it impact less than 1% of total transactions produced. So the reality is we're not seeing substantial changes there. Interest rate hikes certainly will take some people out of the market altogether. I think it'll be most impactful on those who are trying to get in largely as first-time buyers. But certainly addressing the supply side is the only thing that will fundamentally affect price.
Okay, supply is the issue once again. Okay, Kevin Krigger, Councillor Bailau, and Richard Lyle, thank you so much for this discussion here on CP24 Tonight.
Thank you.
Well, we are about 2 months away from the provincial election, scheduled for June the 2nd. Also on the schedule, the budget, which was supposed to take place today. But last month, the Ford government rewrote a provincial law to delay the budget and avoid paying a penalty. The budget now has to be delivered by April the 30th. Well, as we look forward to Election Day, a new Angus Reid poll shows 37% of decided voters say they would vote for Premier Ford and the PC party, but the poll also shows Ontarians are much more likely to say that the Ford government has done a poor job versus a good one in its handling of all the issues noted in the survey. Here to break down the poll and the issues, Shachi Kurl, president of the Angus Reid Institute, and journalist Alan S. Hale with Queen's Park today. Thank you so much for joining us. Shachi, let me start with you. This seems ironic that the PCs will get reelected, but people in the poll are dissatisfied with almost their handling of every issue. So right now, are we inching toward a PC majority? If so, why or why not?
Oh, so much to unpack.
Yeah.
First of all, 2 months is millennia in politics, as we know. So there's a lot of road to go. You could be in a situation where 10 days before the election, something happens or changes, and that may well be the case. Let's hope for an exciting campaign. So there's a couple of different things to unpack. First of all, there is a difference between being unhappy with the job your government is doing, whether that's a federal government, a provincial government, a municipal government, and having an appetite for change. Because, of course, the choice for voters isn't Doug Ford or not Doug Ford, or the PCPO or not the PCPO. It's Doug Ford or Andrea Horwath or Mr. Del Duca. So you've got 3 different options. And, you know, are Ontarians ready to go to return to Ontario Liberal government? Or are they still in the penalty box? Certainly the polling puts them at a place that only has about a quarter of decided voters. Mm-hmm. And you see that left of center vote split very much between the NDP and the Liberals, which of course speaks to an advantage for the PCs in Ontario. Notwithstanding the fact that we were actually in field with this poll right before the announcement of the $10 a day childcare program that's now been rolled out and announced. So let's see what the impact of that is, particularly on parents of younger children. Does that move the needle one way or another? And of course, the other huge X factor that will be very determinant over the coming weeks is what happens with the pandemic. As we know, Ontarians are not happy with the Ford government's take on pandemic management. They don't really give them winning points on anything, on any issue across the board. But if the pandemic gets worse, and if Premier Ford is seen to be out of step with responding to that, it could be very challenging. On the other hand, this is a politician who has shown he can pivot. He has shown that he is not interested in getting involved in federal conservative politics. And those are two things that may help him along the way.
Alan, I promise we'll get to you. But Sachi, when we consider, you talked about the moving of the needle here. Premier Ford has moved up 13 points this quarter in terms of his approval rating. So if there were to be an election today, let's say, and we know that the politicians all say the only poll that counts is on election day, are we inching toward a PC majority? I mean, how likely is that to happen again?
I don't want to commit to anything 2 months before Election Day. But what I will say is if this trend continues, and again, we really have to think about leadership here, and we have to think about whether Ontarians have an appetite to see a change in their provincial leadership, then that will certainly put the Ontario Conservatives in a much more comfortable place than they might have been a while ago. And so what are some of the factors around that? Again, pandemic management is going to be a big part of it, but also let's see what's in this budget. We know that incumbent governments love to table budgets right before an election or heading into an election period that is filled with goodies. And then again, this is not Ms. Horwath's first rodeo or indeed her first election. She hasn't made the case to Ontarians yet for why Ontario should go back to an NDP government. We haven't seen NDP government at the provincial level in Ontario since the early 90s. And let's see if there is an appetite to bring the Ontario Liberals, the era of Kathleen Wynne and Dwight Duncan, back to the fold, or if the Ontario Liberals, after many, many years in government, are still in the penalty box. Usually when we see a big, significant change, I'll finish this point because I want to hear what Alan has to say. Where we are at often is a change in government generally leads to at least 2 terms. And that's just what history shows us. There's always exceptions. Let's see what happens. Game on.
That's a good tidbit of perspective. Sachi, thank you. Alan, on that note, I want to point out that in this recent poll from the Angus Reid Institute, the Liberals actually moved up several points. I believe it is 6 from memory. I'm wondering, Alan, what do you think is the reason the PCs are polling so well, but then when we look at the breakdown of issues, they are failing because of the lack of confidence the voting public has in the NDP or Liberals? Is that what it is, you think?
I'm not sure, honestly. I think there's definitely a bit of inertia, I think, behind this poll. Things are getting better. We've lifted restrictions, and I think people are feeling good about that. I do think the point where a change of government does tend to have 2 terms is a very poignant one. But I also think that the Conservatives over this past term have really gotten the message, and that message is that Ontario doesn't really want a hard, fiscally conservative government. Before his brother died, Doug Ford was always talking about how he wanted to stop the gravy train. But really, if you've looked at what they've been up to in the past couple weeks with just day after day after day of new funding announcements, really Doug Ford is driving the gravy train at this point.
And
I think it might be working for them.
Yeah, well, there's a housing affordability announcement, or sorry, I should say there was an announcement yesterday on getting, homes and condos and apartments built faster here in the province, but the part of it that was supposed to be about affordability didn't really land. So I want to get to that because when we look at the poll put out by Sachi and her team, the big issue people have with the Ford government, and we can put up some of the numbers here, is that they feel, the respondents, the Ford government is failing when it comes to housing affordability. But Alan, when we look at some of the other issues, Ontarians' feelings about poverty and homelessness, and senior care. Those are the ones where the Ford government got these failing grades. When we look at these topics, they fall under the same theme, the most vulnerable in our community. Is the continued feeling in the lead up to the election going to be the PCs don't prioritize the most vulnerable? This is also the group that's less likely to vote, and no one is going to forget the tragedy in long-term care, and in which the inquiry, or I should say, the inquest, the inquiry that took place. I'm trying to recall the wording. It was not a public inquiry. It was a report, a commission. So what do you think? What impact will that have?
Well, I think the PCs would like very much for people to forget what happened to long-term care. And I think they're trying to make the people who aren't likely to just look to the future and not worry about what happened in the past. They're trying to assuage those concerns with, well, lots more like funding announcements. I don't think a week goes by where we don't get an announcement from the government about them building a new long-term care home or expanding beds at an existing one. They're also trying to, they're finally making the personal support workers pay increase that they got during the
and that's become permanent.
They've made that permanent at last, and I really think they're just trying to portray themselves as being like good stewards of the system from here on out, and maybe that'll work. Maybe that will assuage the concerns. I don't think the opposition is likely to let them do that. The message definitely will be they'll be hammering them on this the entire campaign.
Final question here for Shachi. We have 45 seconds. When we take a look at the opposition, as I was saying to Alan, your poll has the NDP in second, but they dropped 4 points. And as I was saying, the Liberals in third, but they had some growth in polling numbers. Why the growth there from the Liberals? Where does any of this leave questions or early backroom talks on a potential NDP Liberal deal? What do you think?
So the early backroom talks, and we've seen some speculation about that, to the extent that they hold water or don't, really changes the political calculus for Ontario voters, because then they have to decide, do we want an NDP Liberal government in Ottawa, and do we also want an NDP Liberal government at Queen's Park? Yes or no? Completely different ballot question. So again, this really comes down to, you know, who brings the better game in this campaign? What is the appetite for change? And remembering always that in politics, it is generally a game of inches. So do the number of people upset over education, over mask mandates in schools, who have dealt with the tragedies of family members being lost in long-term care, does that swing the political math in one direction? And do those feel-good, big money spending announcements swing voters in another direction? And if affordability ends up becoming a key emerging issue, again, we're going to have to see not only how does the Ford government respond, but how do the opposition parties respond? And can they make a case that they will be better stewards to solve things like housing affordability? Lots to cover.
And we got to go on that note, Shachi. I want to thank you. Thank Alan. We have 2 months and 2 days to continue to talk about this. Thank you both tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you.